we've talked about the different methods of homeschooling. I think we should talk a little bit about some of the books that we have sitting in front of us and why.
Okay.
If you know, like I've mentioned 2 other books that we read early on that don't happen to be sitting here. So the books we brought are the books that we've gone back to year after year.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And so at the very, very beginning, asking, how did we figure out this is, like, I didn't know when I picked this up, this was going to be the book I would go back to every
right.
to reset my focus. So there is trial and error in that, and I think that when you decide to bring your children home or to just start homeschooling them from the very beginning, it is a job. Teaching is a job. Mm-hmm. Full-time parenting is a job. Mm-hmm. Full-time discipleship is a job. I mean, nursing and janitoring and all the things. Mm-hmm. I mean, those are jobs. And so I think that the first thing you have to do is to really acknowledge the fact that this is a commitment you're making. And as in any other line of work, you are going to learn about what it is that you're doing. And so you start going to some of these books and fellow homeschool moms. So if you have different people in your community that you know of, just start talking to them. Just ask if they'll go out to coffee. People have done that with me many times, and they did not always choose to homeschool. Yeah. And they did not always choose to homeschool the way that I do it. Mm-hmm. But I think that's how you figure out what your version of this is going to work, because you know what your family needs.
And it can take some time to figure that out. You might
Yes.
read books, about different kinds of homeschooling and glean a little bit from all of them, or try one for a while and it doesn't work and you change your mind and go with something else. Yeah.
Or say, I like this, like you were saying, I like this part. What's my blend going to look like?
Yeah. So what would be a good book to start with for a general idea about homeschooling philosophy?
I think your book you have.
I know. This is what I read for the children's sake.
Yes.
Susan Schaefer Macaulay.
I think that's kind of a square one
it's
book.
A great
I think
place
it's
to start.
Before you even get to Wholehearted Child.
I think that you could be right. I think that
because it's so philosophy based.
Yes. So when I re-looked at this, which I haven't in longer than I normally, but I was reminded very quickly. I mean, even just the first 4 pages. I mean, here's the other thing I want to say. If you can borrow books from people, borrow them. Like, don't feel like you have to go invest $100 in or more, in 7 different types of homeschooling books. And right off the bat, I'll also say your homeschooling is never going to look exactly like somebody else's. So don't think I can go interview Christina and it's going to look just like she's done it and my outcome is going to be the same. I mean, I think that's a real tendency to compare and get yourself locked into an idea.
And there would be a spiritual problem with that too, because God didn't make my family.
The same
He doesn't
way.
need another set of kids. So,
but I will say the first 4 pages of this book are very, why am I doing this?
And what's that one called?
Educating the Wholehearted Child by
Sally Clarkson.
Clay and Sally Clarkson. So Sally Clarkson has written many wonderful books about motherhood and
love her books.
Very servant-hearted, and it reminds me of a lot of the principles that are in For the Children's Sake. Why am I choosing to do this? And we can't talk about doing this without a spiritual foundation. So it's rich with scripture and what are your responsibilities as a Christian parent, and to be even just thinking through some of the questions they pose, no matter what your ultimate decision is. I think it's just really helpful in foundational why am I doing this? Because there are times it's really hard and you want to chuck it, and it's really good to go back and say, okay,
remind yourself.
Remind myself, if I chose something different, what would I be giving up? And this, I think both of those books paint a really good picture for that. So.
Right.
But this one is more practical. I mean, there's a bunch of how to, and it's much more talking about the growth of and development, different methods of teaching. It's much more kind of it's philosophy and then application.
Okay. Yeah. This one would be more philosophy, kind of why you're doing what you're doing, who is a child, what do they need. This, I would say, would be more Charlotte Mason, you think?
Although that's where they predominate. I would love to ask Sally, but I would say she drew a lot from Charlotte Mason. So tell us about Susan Schaefer Macaulay.
Those
tell
ideas.
us about
she talks about
who is she?
why don't you tell?
No, you do too. You know.
She's the daughter of Francis Schaeffer. Mm-hmm. She grew up in Europe. She has lived all over the world and educated her own children and set up schools that were based on Charlotte Mason ideas, I think. But she talks about building an atmosphere in your home of learning, which I just love, because education does not happen just between 8 and 3. Mm-hmm. You know, it's how your home works, and just the books and music and literature that you have available to your children, what your family structure is like as far as like how you spend your time, spending a lot of time outdoors and in nature and things like that. So she would kind of send you down the Charlotte Mason road. Yeah.
And
Well,
I have to say, because I feel like when I was curious about homeschooling, I'm like, what do you mean? What are the legs on that? What do you? So I'm gonna. No, I want to say this.
Okay.
Okay. So you say all that, right?
Yeah.
So I was the gal, and I think I'm older than you, Christina. Yeah, but you have older kids than me. So I came. When I came into your house, I'm looking around. What is Christina doing? And so you have a sunroom, and it has books, and it had a kid's kitchen, and there are birds outside, and you have 10. It gives me chills remembering walking into that for the first time, because my heart, the environment was just rich with love for children, and the books you always had, like if it was a child's birthday, there were 10 beautiful books about birthdays, and if it was Thanksgiving coming up, there are interlibrary loan books from all over, and there's these gorgeous books, and there's 2 doors going to the outdoors, and little ones just in and out into the woods all day, and then there's a big couch in the next room where a child could curl up with a book. So these ideas that you read about for the first time, and so for someone like you, your mind just sparked. You're like, this is what I'm looking for. And then you made it happen. And so your children have grown up in that environment with these living ideas, with these living books. So anyway, it's just interesting to me to hear you talk about that. And I'm like, all these pictures come into my head.
Because it really did spark with me at the beginning. And so I found what worked for us. And like I said, all these different philosophies work better for different families or people with different interests, or how many children do you have? How are you going to make that work practically? All those kind of things. So what are some other go-to resources for classical learning?
Before we get off the subject of these two, because I do feel like they kind of sum up where we've camped.
Yeah.
The other thing that I think both of these do pretty well is discuss the discipleship issue, discipleship aspect of the decision to homeschool.
Yes.
And I was looking at the back. I was flipping in the back of her book, and she's talking about just different things that they were reading and the discussions that they were able to have in later years. Particularly, this is where I see shades of her father.
Yeah.
That really that worldview issue of taking the things of the world and taking every thought captive. And what do we when we're reading a book that has some pretty heavy content, not to be afraid of that as Christians, but to look at that and say, so where does the humanistic worldview take you, and setting them up for those conversations because of what you've created in their early years. I mean, that environment is leading you somewhere. And she does this too, talking early on, and like in page 1, she talks about how our children, it is right for us to be with our children and to walk alongside them, and to I don't want to necessarily turn this into a reading session, but it's just a really good setting the stage for why are we choosing this lifestyle, and what are we doing. And the other ones that we mentioned before for classical, well-trained mind,
which I think is great for a lot of people to read. I gleaned from that.
I did too.
Sure.
I really did. I would not know. I mean, just because I would not call myself a classical educator. I would recommend looking through that book. There's a lot in there to consider.
And it's given me a great appetite for the books that the classical student is reading.
Absolutely.
That I did not grow up with, and that are a hole in my heart. I mean, I think that, this year my kids were studying ancient cultures, Greece and Rome, and so we read the Iliad. We read, you know, a
Right.
version of the Odyssey.
Right.
These classical treasures that you just don't want to miss, you know, that have gotten pushed off. So I think when I've read these books about classical education, it's sparked,
Right.
you
Well,
know,
and-
ooh.
there you go.
Yeah, and I would say too, to feel free to learn alongside your children. You don't have to
No.
have read all
Right.
these books before. You don't have to understand it all. You open up the book and you read it out loud and you learn alongside them.
Exactly.
And that really is a huge benefit to them to see you excited about something,
Right.
learning with them. You do not have to be an expert in classical studies to be able to
No.
teach these great books.
Yeah.
And I think that's another thing that the classical method does really well is the timeline. And I have seen that emphasizing a timeline from creation all the way to modern times, it really does help,
yes.
especially when those two things are lockstep with the Bible. It, again, like when we were talking about unit studies, it does draw those pieces together. So you suddenly don't have a fractured, you know, version of secular history and biblical history, but you
Right.
realize like
What was happening
Yes,
at the
and
same
these were
time.
sometimes one and the same thing.
Yes.
Recovering the Lost Tools of Learning was a book that came out, probably 20-ish years ago, and so I think a lot of the classical, Douglas Wilson wrote that.
Probably even further back
maybe
than that.
further than back
It probably
than
was
that.
early 90s. But
So
these two books also were foundational for me. I read them both. It sparked, you know, and any of these, if we were to reread them, there would be fresh material.
Oh,
it would be
absolutely.
so refreshing.
Yes.
This book, Better Late Than Early, conference that we all went to when our kids were young, the speaker there really drew a lot from the couple, Raymond and Dorothy Moore, who were kind of that first generation homeschoolers in America. But this book, Better Late Than Early, doesn't read like these, which, I mean, this one is much more poetic. It's very easy to read. This is very research-based. But I had come out of teaching in a school that had a rigorous preschool program with a dynamic preschool teacher, and we had our 4 and 5-year-olds reading, and full day, 5 day a week, you know, preschool. And, you know, those little ones hit it hard. And that's why would you wait when life is so rigorous, you know? And this just put the brakes on that for me. I mean, I think these two books, for the children's sake, and the research behind this, because when I was coming up as a young teacher, everything was research driven. I mean, that phrase,
sure.
it's like,
Yes.
it's research driven.
Yeah.
You couldn't ever just do something based on joy or enjoyment, you know. But this has served me really well because it slowed everything down, and we spent a lot more time reading stories. We spent a lot of time getting the discipleship component of our homeschooling going, of establishing the family worship time that we still to this day is where that's the hub, right? So we get those components going, but the big things like math, phonics, reading, we were setting a foundation for children to have a taste for that and an excitement of like, our family loves reading, our family loves numbers. You know, these are exciting things. We're not putting them off because we think they're not important. But there is just a time that's right, and it's proven by research to be right for that little brain to go, now it's time to read. And so
It's very freeing for the
it's
parent.
so freeing that
And
there's
for the
something
child,
else to do with their time right now. They're not just a little empty vessel that you just shove. And
And there are so many important things for 3 and 4-year-olds to learn.
like this soft feel of their mother's lap.
Just stories and playtime and,
Yeah.
you know, chores and I think relaxing on some of the hardcore academic things. It's just frustrating. I sense frustration in my children, and I was definitely frustrated when I tried to push things too early. So reading that book was very freeing to say.
They say
Your child will be
until your
ready.
child is about 8, you should not be pushing these
Academic.
things. And no, I have a little one, our youngest, that he decided he was going to learn to read this year. I didn't hold him back because I read that book. but our child that struggles with reading, we really didn't
Feel pressure
feel
about it.
pressure or stress. And so anyway, that's lovely. I mean, I will say ideas and philosophy and worldview drive your homeschooling. And if you're not reading, if you're not interested in the ideas that are in books, if you just want to plug your kid into something, you are going to miss the joy that comes from knowing where you're going, right?
And I think I have not thought about relating these two things until right now, but like also like we're talking about ourselves as mothers, and I think that just shaping that role for yourself as the mother, like when you said that about, you know, the soft feel of your mother's lap, like I just feel like our role in our children's lives is just so different than someone who's running carpool lines and, you know, not that I really mean it, like I know those people in my life who are living a life like that genuinely are love and are invested in their children, but just that homeschooling is going to make your motherhood look different. And I'm looking at some of the other books that you have here, June, that really speak to that, like Loving the Little Years. And I don't think she's a homeschooler, but she really does.
No.
She's not, but
woo,
she really
she's
loves,
put
like
me
she,
into shape
yeah,
of
in terms
how
of
to-
mothering.
Yes.
Sally Clarkson's books are great. The Mission of Motherhood is amazing. Seasons of a Mother's Heart. I mean, just really convicting and sets up sort of why not just why am I educating my child this way, but why am I choosing to spend my role as a mother this way?
Yeah.
Right.
I will just put a plug in
Yes,
for
please
this book.
do.
Anthony Eslin is a writer, and he teaches at the college level. I think he interpreted Dante.
He did.
But so 10 ways to destroy the imagination of your child. When I saw this on my husband's bedside table, I thought, I thought I don't need to read it. I value my child's imagination. I've read these books.
Right.
What could he have to say that, you know, I don't already agree with? And he tore me up one side and down the other. I mean, I was just blown away at the way I let culture creep in to my philosophy. And he's one of those authors that does that. What he uses so many examples from classic literature in a way that doesn't, you know how academic people hold you like this? They're like, I know this reference to Dante and you don't, and don't you feel stupid now? I will reread this. I love it so much because you go, oh, I don't know this story, but he explains it so beautifully, and he uses to illustrate how important it is for little boys to know their boys and girls to know their girls, and all these examples from literature, and you're like, I've got to read all those books.
Yeah.
Culture has crept in. Yeah, it's an extremely convicting book. It's so wonderful, and it has
Okay, I'm
definitely.
gonna borrow that one from you then.
Yes, you just take it.